In 1965, Mikhail Tal made a deep run in the candidates match cycle as he tried to secure another world championship match. His first match was against the Hungarian Lajos Portisch. Tal determined that Portisch was a great strategic player, which is why he instead chose to mix it up with tactics in this game. Opening preparation is, of course, critical in a match. In this case, Tal decided to open up with pawn to e4. Now, his opponent already surprises him with the move pawn c6. This was game 2 in this match, and Portisch had, to Tal's knowledge, never played the Caro Kann defense before. Of course, this sets off warning bells in Tal's head because this is a match, the players are prepared, and he knows that his opponent must have looked at basically all of the Caro Kann games that Tal had played in his life. That includes his match with Botvinnik, which was a big part of the Caro Kann theory that Tal had developed over his life. So he decided to go for something original right off the bat and say, hey, you've never played the Caro Kann before. If I take us into fresh waters, maybe I'm going to have the advantage in experience. So he goes for the two knights variation here. This is a variation that Bobby Fischer and yours truly have tried to make work without much success. Tal has much more success in this game. Now, the strongest continuation arguably in this position is bishop to g4, pinning the knight here on f3. For a long time, this was thought to really kill this variation, not give white anything, but I think today it's understood that white can play this way for some advantage. Still, this is a sturdy option. Instead, though, Portisch goes pawn takes e4 and then bishop g4. I think it is a mistake to go for this continuation where you've given up your strong point on d5. Why would Portisch do this? I think the reason is that after pawn h3, there is a game in the past where against Botvinnik, Tal had played this line, and after bishop takes f3, without the trade on e4 being included, he had played g takes f3, which is probably not the best continuation anyway, but it produced an interesting position. In this game, though, this is a disaster because there's no pawn on e4 anymore, so white is left with doubled isolated pawns and an isolated pawn on h3, and black is already much, much better. So Portisch forces Tal to play with queen takes f3 instead of g takes f3, again, because of the trade on e4, but this position's pretty nice for Tal. It's not like he's winning, but he's got activity and development, and you may have heard that he's pretty good as an attacking player, so those advantages work in his favor. After queen takes f3, we get knight d7, pawn d4, and the game's going to develop naturally, so I'm going to kind of zip along right here. An interesting move here is queen to g4 at this point, after the knight hops into d5 and the bishop attacks the queen here. Now, you want to defend g7, and you would love to do it by castling. That certainly makes the most sense, but after castling, you lose material because of this move. It seems like this move should deal with the problem well enough, but here queen e4, threat of mate, and after you block the mate, then we capture here. The problem for black is that this little bishop h6, queen e4 combination produces a position where you want to stop the mate by putting your knight on f6, but you've already had to put your bishop on f6, and your two minor pieces can't both go to that critical defensive square. So after queen g4, Portisch's king remains in the center here after bishop f6, and now rook to e1. Tal is certainly building up some aggressive ideas here. You may be familiar with the famous game where against Botvinnik he sacrificed a piece on e6. Here he's thinking about sacrificing more than a minor piece. His opponent now could have played a sturdy move like queen e7, and Tal's advantage is small. Nothing to write home about. The game will continue for some time. Instead, though, Portisch tried the more active queen b6, where the queen is putting pressure on b2 and maybe more able to support c5 with pressure on d4. Of course, the queen is leaving the middle of the board, and black's king is sitting in the middle of the board, so there is inherent risk here, and Tal is certainly kind of set off by this move. I'm going to read here a quote from Tal's notes to the game. At this point, correct one can also write it without the inverted commas, was the reserved a3, with the hope of exploiting the famous pair of bishops in a protracted struggle. Before the match, we had noticed that the Hungarian Grandmaster had an excellent feel for the most subtle strategic nuances, but reacts less confidently to sudden tactical turns. This, and also the fact that the Black King had stood with impunity in the center of the board for 14 moves, provoked the following reaction. So, Tal expands here with the move pawn to c4. Now, this move is strategically a disaster, but tactically, pushing the knight out of the center of the board makes great sense. Knight to b4, hitting the loose bishop on d3, and if the bishop just moves away, then d4 is falling because c4 has left that vulnerable. Of course, Tal's intention was absolutely not to cravenly retreat the bishop on d3. Instead, he goes for rook takes e6 check, and boom! This is one of Tal's greater sacrifices. Of course, he has maybe hundreds of great sacrifices in his career, but at the candidate stage, sacrificing a whole rook on e6 like this is truly audacious. Now, after rook takes e6 check, Black doesn't really have a good way to not take the rook. For example, king over here saying, hey, you still got a bunch of stuff hanging, maybe I'll take you next turn. Runs right into rook takes f6, and a capture here is meeting with a strong bishop check. So, Black does take the rook on e6, f takes e6, and queen takes e6 check, producing a critical position where Portisch has three decisions here. Do you move the king or do you block with the bishop? All choices are possible. The strongest choice was king to d8, when by Tal's own admission, he did not see anything better than taking a draw by perpetual check here. We go queen d6 check, king e8, queen back to e6 check, and you could change your mind and decide to avoid the draw as Black, but as long as the king goes to d8, Tal does not have better than draw. Do note that if the king tries to go over here, well, that's a checkmate, so Black is going to, of course, avoid trying to run this far. The other option available besides the move played in the game is bishop e7, and this is a really interesting position here. There's a tempting option for Tal that does not work. We're going to look at that first. That is the move bishop to g5. The problem here is that Portisch can hold with queen c7, and then when you pile up on the e-file, Black takes your bishop on d3, very greedy, and bishop takes e7, queen d7 here. And this amazing move, queen d7, holds the game for Black. There's an offer of a queen trade. The bishop's still vulnerable on e7 here. No discovered checks work because of the queen trade, and the rook is still hanging on e1. I think this defensive idea from Black is really wonderful. I would be terrified of allowing this kind of buildup on the e-file, but at the last moment, Black holds it together and wins the game. However, this provokes an interesting idea from Tal. He found an improvement. After bishop e7, he can throw in the move bishop to g6 check, another brilliant move. The whole point of this seemingly silly sacrifice is that after h takes g6, now there's the possibility of accessing the g6 square for white in the lines we were just looking at. Bishop g5, again you defend e7, I bring the rook, and now if you try queen to d7 here, then this square is available to the white queen, so we have queen takes g6 check. Next move, we will take on e7, and we will win the game. Really fantastic stuff. Now, Portisch wouldn't have had to go for this after the bishop sacrifice on g6 if he saw what Tal was planning. He could play the move king d8 here, and after king d8, we have more interesting lines. Bishop f5, threatening mate here. Two choices for Black, queen c7 and queen takes d4. Queen c7 loses to bishop f4, and of course the queen has to stay in defense of d7 here. So she falls back to c8, but queen e4, and she is trapped here. What a wonderful lineup from the bishops. So the other option is the better option. Queen takes d4, very greedy, and now the d-file is open for white. Tal comments that he was very attracted to playing this position after bishop f4. There is enough compensation for white here according to both Tal and Stockfish, but we can't reach an ultimate conclusion in this complicated position. White is still down a rook and hunting for mate against the exposed black king. To get to the final evaluation here would probably need alpha 0 and some hours of analysis. So we're going to leave it here and say that this would have been a very interesting position to observe Tal try to work his magic. In the game, after queen takes e6 check, the selection from Portisch was king to f8, not the bishop e7 or king d8 lines that we looked at. Now, after king f8, we have bishop f4 threatening a checkmate starting with bishop to d6 check. Again, we have a critical moment because there are multiple tempting options available to Portisch. We're going to look quickly at a few of them. The most notable problem here is that in a lot of lines, black ends up bound up on the e file and there's time for a rook lift. For example, queen d8 allows rook e1, threatening this bishop check here. So you might try bishop e7, holding off that check on d6, but then this hanging bishop can just pull back and there's no defense to rook e5 and rook f5. White is winning here. Really great stuff. There are other lines that play very, very similarly. For example, rook e8 here. This is a little different, but after bishop d6 check, you're again getting into trouble on the e file. Bishop e7 is the worst choice. Rook e1, you might feel like this is a better version for white because, hey, we got a rook on e8 and a queen on d8 to defend e7, right? But still, there's no response to a rook lift. We finish the game off. A better choice is after bishop d6 check, rook e7, but we can just pile up on the pinned piece here going after this, and when the queen falls back to defend, then the b4 knight is loose because the queen is no longer defending it from b6. In the game, these continuations that led to troubles along the e-file were avoided as Portisch played the continuation rook d8, which is the best available defensive option. King f8, not the best option, but rook d8, best option from Portisch. After rook d8 here, one tempting option for Tal is rook e1, saying, hey, I'm going to throw in a bishop check and then I'll mate you right here. For example, you take my bishop on d3, and I finish in a beautiful, beautiful fashion. Checkmate. Gotcha. Right? Unfortunately for Tal, this doesn't work because after rook e1 here, there are two defenses for black. One is queen takes d4, defending d6, so that bishop takes, queen takes, holds everything. The other option is c5, and both options refute Tal's attack. Therefore, Tal, after rook d8, plays the move pawn to c5 here. This disrupts the queen, stopping both the c5 move and the queen takes d4 move that were the response to rook e1. So now, if the queen moves over to a5, the only available square, rook e1. And there is no defense this time to bishop d6 check and queen e8 checkmate. At least no defense that is tenable at all for black. So, after pawn c5 here, there's not really a good choice for Portisch. He must give up the queen on b6. The good news is he's getting a lot for the queen. Portisch now takes on d3, and Tal takes the queen here on b6. I'll mention that Tal also liked the possibility of bishop h6 check, bishop h6 here, which is very sassy and delightful. But bishop h6 here should only lead to a draw after queen takes b2, which attacks this right here. And then we have queen takes check, and the queen can come back. You can check the notes for more interesting comments on this bishop h6 line. In the game, though, after black took this bishop on d3, Tal, of course, took on b6, grabbing the queen. It is fascinating to me that Tal is even considering attacking alternatives to taking the queen here. I would have taken the queen without ever even considering a move like bishop h6. I think that is a testament to the brilliance of Tal that he's still considering crazy moves that do actually work fairly well, like bishop h6, but he wants more than a draw, and that's all he has after bishop h6. So c takes b6. Knight takes on f4, attacking the queen here. The queen falls back, attacking the knight. The knight heads to the amazing d5 square, and Tal captures on a7. This is a great point to read more of Tal's notes on this fantastic position. Tal says, a position has arisen with a rather unusual material balance. White has a queen and 3 pawns against a rook and 2 minor pieces. If Black succeeds in coordinating his forces, then he will clearly have the better chances. There are 2 factors which hinder this. The audacious pawn on a7, which at the very least frightens Black, and although only temporary, the difficulty of developing his king's rook. With his next move, Portisch tries to solve these 2 problems simultaneously, but the further course of the game shows that his plan is incorrect. So, in this position, the strongest move was pawn to g6, which is given by Tal. After g6, Portisch can just put his king on g7. He's defending the 8th rank very well, and his position is relatively sturdy. Still, the pawn on a7 is a big distraction, so it's hard for Black to play for a win here. I think that the advantage still lies with White, although the position is pretty unclear and anything could happen after pawn to g6. Portisch instead played the move king to e7, which I think we can safely dub as ballsy, but maybe a little too much so. I'm not sure I really understand why king e7 was preferred to pawn g6. Of course, it's not obvious how to bring down the king in the middle of the board, but still, why are you putting the king in the middle of the board? This is creating lots of problems. I think this is an example of a great player overthinking things, which happens, I think, in chess more often than you might think. Sometimes a grandmaster makes a decision like king e7 that I think an amateur player like myself would never even consider. In any case, after king e7, Tal's back on the attack here. Pawn to b4. Now he's got ideas to break things up, to open more lines for this rook and for the queen, and to go after the king on e7. And at this point, he's clearly better, maybe even already winning. So pawn to b4, great move. Of course, you don't take because after rook b1, there is too much going on here. Black could play rook takes d4, which defends this and attacks the queen, but there are multiple good moves for White, including this one, which is very nice, showing the power of the queen here in an open position, especially with the king being on a square like e7. The queen's tremendous potency is really felt here. After b4, rook a8 is played to block this pawn here and hopefully to scoop it up. Rook e1 check, king to d6, b5. Great move here, ripping up the queen side here and also thinking about the possibility of simply pushing the pawn to b6 when the a7 pawn is secure and there's not a lot of options for Black to develop counterplay. So, for example, after rook d8, you can play b6 here. Since Black doesn't want to allow this security, you can take, but then rook b1, you don't want to move and let this fall, but you can't hold on after this. Rook takes b6 is a tactic that should win the game here after king takes. Then the rook on d6 falls and White is up material. So after pawn to b5, we saw rook takes a7. This is the losing blunder in a very difficult position. Tal immediately seizes his chance. Rook e6 check, king over, and rook takes f6. A nice finish. The point is, of course, that the g7 square is no longer defended after the rook sacrifice. So whichever way Black captures back, the queen will access that square, which means that the rook is falling here on h8. So after rook takes f6, Portisch resigned. Ultimately, Tal did win a very interesting and hard-fought match and advanced to the next round of the candidates to play Bent Larsen. If you like that game, then check out more Tal games sitting right over here on top of the chessboard.